Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for attending this month's webinar presented by Dr. Pallavi Pant on Perspectives on Science Communication, Social Media for Scientists. My name is Nicole Tulvey and I am the chair of the membership committee for the International Society for Exposure Science, and I will be moderating this webinar. For those of you who are not society members, please consider joining the society as we offer many benefits to our members, including exclusive access to the recording of this webinar, as well as the presentation after today's live session. So before we get started, we have a few quick housekeeping notes. In the upper right-hand panel of your computer screen, you'll see your control panel. Please note that the webinar is in listen-only mode. Throughout the presentation, if you have a question, please type it in the question box, and we will ask all questions at the completion of Pallavi's presentation. As I mentioned earlier, today's speaker is Dr. Pallavi Pant. Dr. Pant is a staff scientist at the Health Effects Institute based in Boston, Massachusetts. She holds a PhD in environmental health from the University of Birmingham in the UK, where she studied urban air pollution. She completed her postdoctoral research training in exposure science at the Department of Environmental Health Sciences at the University of Amherst, Massachusetts Amherst. Her research is focused on characterization and assessment of urban air pollution, and she has written a variety of peer-reviewed and popular media articles on air pollution. She serves as the social media editor for the Journal of Exposure Science and Environmental Epidemiology. She's a TEDMED 2020 research scholar. She is active in initiatives to promote public understanding of air pollution and its impacts, including digital knowledge platforms on air pollution in South Asia. And with that introduction, I will turn the presentation over to Pallavi.
Thank you, Nicole, and welcome everyone. I'm glad you could take the time to join us for this webinar today, where we will be talking about social media and how we can all use it as scientists. We will also try to keep this session somewhat action-oriented, so I would request you to keep your laptop or cell phones handy. To get us started, I have an easy question for you. Which social media platforms do you typically use? We'll give you a few minutes to respond to this, and we'll come back to this in a few slides. But essentially, let's think about why we really need social media for engagement. And to begin that conversation, we have to take a step back and think about the scientific research process. For most of us, what science really entails is thinking about hypotheses, testing them using either experiments in the lab or in the field, or doing data analysis, and deriving results, conclusions, publishing them in peer-reviewed literature. And that's where other scientists or other people can access this information, use it to try and do more science. And the body of science continues to grow. We have more and more people publishing a lot of research in journal articles, but a lot of it is behind paywalls and written in a language that only some of us are able to follow in its entirety. So if we think about science being for the benefit of the society at a very fundamental level, we should also be thinking about how to make this more accessible for a broader group of people, the general public, the policymakers, the journalists, and other civil society groups and other stakeholders who have an interest in the different fields of science we study. And the idea of science communication has gained a lot of importance in the last few years. Several funding agencies have now started including discussions on science communication and specific activities in their research and grant proposals. And people are using a variety of tools to try and do science communication. You could be writing or blogging about your science in ways that is accessible to a broader public. You could work directly with journalists at newspapers and digital media outlets to try and explain the relevance of new scientific findings for the broader world, or you could engage directly with your local community, schools and community offices, hospitals, a variety of places where you could have very direct one-on-one personal engagement. But one really useful and easily accessible tool that we have available to us is social media. And in today's seminar, we're going to primarily focus on social media, talk a little bit about why do we really want to use social media, or why should we be thinking about using social media? There's of course pros and cons with each decision we make. So we'll try and dig into that a little bit. We'll talk a little bit about some of the social media platforms that are most commonly used. Some things to consider if you're planning to get active on social media, and then we'll have a Q&A session towards the end of the talk. So what is social media? Essentially, we are thinking or talking about a variety of web applications or tools that are available to us for creating content, sharing it with other people, having discussions and dialogues. The most common platforms that come to mind are platforms like Twitter or Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, but there's actually a very long list of social media platforms that we could be using. There's TikTok, which is gaining a lot of prominence now. There's Reddit, YouTube, Pinterest. I could go on and on. And then when we go into specific regions of the world, China is a good example there. There are specific local language-based platforms. So Weibo and WeChat are very popular in China and are used extensively by the public, by scientific community as well, to try and talk more about science. And just looking at the poll results here, about 40% of you have said you use Facebook, about 30% have said you use LinkedIn, and about 10% are Twitter and Instagram. So that's an interesting mix of social media platforms that people are using. I personally use a variety of platforms. As Nicole mentioned earlier, I serve as the social media editor for GESI. Some of you might be aware, it's sort of the affiliate journal for the International Society for Exposure Science. And we are active on Twitter as well as Facebook. I mostly use Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn myself. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today will be derived from my personal experience of having used this over time and the body of evidence that is increasingly studying science communication tools and how social media can be most effective in communicating about our science. So the one question that I often get in my conversations with people about social media as a tool for science communication is, why do we need to be doing social media in the first place? What can it help us do? What can it help us achieve? And in my experience and the experience of many others who've been using social media, you can actually do a lot. For starters, you could network and communicate with peers. A lot of scientists increasingly use platforms like Twitter and LinkedIn and to some extent Facebook to communicate with peers, to talk about their research, to talk about new questions and new science that is coming up. So it's also a good platform to stay updated on the new publications, on any new major themes that are emerging, any new questions people are raising. It can be a very good platform for you to raise attention or bring more attention to your work. You can highlight specific things. You can put your research in context of the wider discussion. You can make it more accessible to a very large group of people. And you can also get feedback. You can ask people for advice. I know a lot of times when we read about social media on the newspapers and other sort of outlets, there's a lot of talk about the negative discussions on social media, especially on Twitter. There's definitely all of that, but there's also a lot of positive feedback, a lot of advice, a lot of just peer-to-peer sharing. And I personally benefited from that quite a bit. I could continue counting people that I first met on social media, and then over time I met them in person. I have collaborated with them in terms of research. I have collaborated with them on science communication activities, and some of them have become really good real-life friends after our discussions on social media. Just yesterday, for example, I was following the launch of a new satellite, which went up in South Korea, which is going to be monitoring air quality. And there were a bunch of colleagues who were tweeting about it and just highlighting what's going on every step of the way. So it almost felt like we were there, even though I wasn't physically in the place of the launch. And then one other thing that as academics and scientists can be really helpful, especially if you're an early career researcher, is that a lot of scientists and a lot of people in academia advertise jobs on social media increasingly, and you can reach out to them, you can have informal conversations with them. If you are looking to hire someone, Twitter or LinkedIn are also good places to find good candidates and bring your job ads to their attention. But at the same time, I wouldn't downplay all of the question marks or concerns that people have about social media. There are issues, there are legitimate concerns, and it can be very intimidating. So over the next few slides, I would like to talk about some of the social media platforms and also how and where they can be helpful. But just to back up all of what I just said about the benefits of social media, backing it up with a little more evidence as a scientist, here's just a quick snapshot, and these are all examples from Twitter. But what I wanted to highlight here was essentially that you could use Twitter for a lot of different things. For example, I have used it in the past when I was teaching at UMass Amherst to ask people working on specific fields to give me short videos talking about their work, which I then used in a class on environmental health. There are people who use it to connect to peers. In some cases, there are specific activities and campaigns on social media. Science-a-thon is a really good example that comes to mind, which are trying to raise the profile of science and what scientists do, humanizing what scientists do and who they are, and at the same time raising money for things like improving gender and diversity in the scientific community. You could also use it for highlighting and promoting and reaching out to more people with regards to new initiatives. So Amy Zota, for example, who is one of our Jesse associate editors, has recently started a new initiative bringing up sort of underrepresented voices in environmental health. And she has been using Twitter and other social media platforms to try and reach a broader audience. So there are many different ways in which you could be using it. And the question, or the sort of biggest learning that I can think of, which is echoed by many other people in a lot of writing that I have seen, is that it also forces you in some ways to think about your own science and your own research within a larger context of, how do I present this? What does this mean for the bigger context? What words do I use? And especially on Twitter, where you only get 280 characters, how do you describe what you're doing or what the relevance of your work is? So in the long run, it helps you become a better communicator in general, and helps you in taking that larger perspective into account. But what's the best platform? There are so many out there. And the first thing I want to highlight is that you don't need to be on all of them. The best idea is to start with one and just stick to it, figure out how to go around it. And then if you want to expand to other platforms, definitely do that by all means. The one that is most commonly used by scientists these days is Twitter. So it's, very fast response time. You can respond almost instantaneously. You are generally writing very short messages, so 280 characters or less. And you're able to, get feedback, give feedback, comment on things, do a lot of that. And then LinkedIn, again, is sort of more professional. You can use it for sharing information, but it's less instantaneous in some ways and less reaction oriented in some ways. Things like Instagram or YouTube are a slightly different ballgame in the sense that you need to have a lot of content creation time. You need images or video if you're thinking about Instagram, and for YouTube, you definitely need video content. But these are also good platforms to live stream events. If you have a very interesting seminar happening at your campus, or if you're holding a workshop, then you can use Facebook and Instagram and YouTube to actually live stream pieces or all of these events. So there are added advantages built into it. Facebook is slightly different in the sense that you can write longer posts. You can also set up specific pages. You can create groups. You can interact with groups of people. So there is a slightly different engagement style on Facebook, but a lot of people use it. And as we see here, a lot of the attendees in the webinar today use it. And you can use it pretty effectively to try and get your message across, especially if you're focusing on a particular kind of audience. The other piece here, which I'm not getting into quite a lot, is there are other platforms. I mentioned Snapchat, I mentioned Reddit, I mentioned TikTok, and all of those are being used by people to do very creative things and communicating science in a lot of ways. Reddit, one of the things that have been done very successfully in the past is AMA sessions or Ask Me Anything sessions, where people just throw questions at you and you answer them, and they can then be used later on by others who are coming along. So I'm talking and focusing mostly on platforms like Twitter and Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, but there are a lot of other ones, and I'm happy to get into more of those during the discussion period if we have time. The next question, which is also sort of critical, is what does this mean in terms of my time management and time commitment to this? So let's do another question, which is more specifically oriented towards your use of social media. So how much time are you willing to spend, or do you actually spend on social media? The American Geophysical Union, or AGU, has a very handy guide that you can use to try and figure out which platform is best for you. And the critical thing when thinking about which platform is best for you is to really think about who is your audience? Who are you trying to target? Are you mostly interested in communicating with peers, other scientists and other researchers who are either based in the same region as you or in other parts of the world? Are you most interested in interacting with the broader public? Are you interested in targeting your efforts of communication towards policymakers? And the reason this question of audience is very important is because what you say and how you say and where you say depends on who you're trying to target. So for example, if I was trying to target the younger people who I want, I want to communicate more about air pollution and health, which is an area that I work in, and I want to be, feeding them sort of good information, reliable, trusted information, my best bet would be Instagram, because that's what a lot of the younger people use and they're most active there. But if I was mostly interested in communicating with other scientists who work on air pollution and health issues around the world, I would probably look to Twitter in the first place, because that's where a lot of my peers are actually active, and that's where they're reading things that they're reading, and that's where they're writing things that they're writing. So there's a variety of options. You can think about what your audience is. You can think about what kind of messaging you're most interested in. Are you trying to just stay focused on getting updates from other researchers? Are you trying to actively go and communicate to a particular audience or to a set of audiences perhaps? And then think about how much time this would take for you. So what I see here in terms of the poll results is that we are evenly split between under 15 minutes per day to 15 to 30 minutes per day, which is actually pretty good time. That's enough time for you to be doing meaningful, relevant stuff if you were clear about what your audience is, what are you trying to say, or what are you trying to do. And one sort of little thing which is sometimes really helpful, you'll see on the screen here is a small QR code. The reason I've put it up here is because QR codes can be a really quick way to direct people to go somewhere you want to. So if you were using any of these social media platforms, you could use specific links or QR codes to direct people to specific pages. You wanted them to go do specific papers, especially if you want people to have access to a peer-reviewed article, which might otherwise be behind the paywall. And the other sort of really critical piece in all of this is that social media, again, is not everything. So we are talking all about social media today, but it is entirely possible that this is not a means of communication that you're most comfortable with or that works with your timelines or what your goals for communication and interaction are. And if that's the case, that is totally fine. If you are interested in science communication, there are a variety of other channels that you can work with. You could think about writing, you could think about more person-to-person interaction. And there's a number of initiatives around the US and worldwide which sort of think about these different aspects. But if you are interested in social media interaction or being on social media, then you need to think a little bit about the fact that all of these social media platforms expect people's engagement and participation. And you will still gain information. You can stay updated about what others are doing, what's happening, new grants that are coming up, new papers that are getting published, conference deadlines that are coming up. A lot of these are constantly posted on social media. But the real value and the real benefit comes when you are willing to engage and when you're having these discussions with people. And again, from my personal experience and in my conversations with other people who use social media, and I would particularly say this for Twitter because I engage with a lot of scientists on Twitter, you can really get a lot out of those discussions. And they may not happen every day. They might happen only every once in a while when someone posts a question and then people start responding to it. And very quickly, it becomes a very rich discussion, all in 280 characters at a time. So give that a little bit of thought. And then finally, not all social media is the same. As I just said, different groups of people, different kinds of stakeholders that you might be interested in reaching out to are going to be active on different social media platforms. So think about who is your audience and think about where are they getting all the information that they're getting, because that's where you need to be. And then getting into some more specifics of what should you be thinking about in setting up a social media and being active on a social media platform, or thinking about setting one up for your lab, for your, as a personal account or a professional account. Really starting with how much time do you have? A lot of you said between 15 to 30 minutes or under 30 minutes, which is a pretty good starting point, especially for platforms like Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter. You don't really need a lot more than that unless you want to spend a lot more time actively. And then who is your audience? Who are you trying to reach? So always think about that in picking the right platform for your work. The other thing which might be relevant for some of you in particular is whether or not there are institutional guidelines wherever you work with regards to use of social media. So think about that and what that means in terms of what you can and cannot say. I think it's, sort of totally appropriate to be thinking about whether or not you should be on social media. What are the kinds of things you can say? And again, the same rules that apply in real life apply in social media. So if there's something you wouldn't say to a person in real life, then maybe you shouldn't be saying it on social media either. What is your tone is a really critical question. And it's also somewhat related to what are the kinds of things you will be posting about. So whether you are on Twitter or on Facebook or on Instagram for that matter, are you focusing mostly on professional posts? Are you also thinking about doing personal posts? What are you most comfortable with? Where is a good balance between the two? These are good questions to be thinking about. And the other thing is, you can always start small. When we think about scientific experiments, we often tend to think about an overall flow, then get in the lab and start tinkering. And then over time, we figure out what's the exact experimental scheme that is going to work and give us the answers to the questions that we're looking for. And it's similar with social media. So if you are a little nervous or a little apprehensive about how all of this is going to go, start small. If you are on Twitter, for example, start with a private profile. So only people that you follow are able, and who follow you, you can control that, and only they have access to what you're saying. Over time, as you get more comfortable, you can start engaging with broader audiences. And again, sort of, whatever makes sense to you in terms of common sense, practical sort of ideas in real life also apply to social media. But one of the biggest concerns has been on what the reaction should be should something go wrong. So what if you say something wrong, or you misquote a number, you misrepresent a study, or something along those lines? Similar to real life, you can step up, say that you've made a mistake and correct it and move on. And that's totally fine. We're all humans. We all make mistakes and things happen. But the other piece of the story is if someone says something on social media that you don't agree with necessarily, and this could be a scientific argument, this could be an argument about the way we think about things, or this could be something, where someone says something blatantly wrong. And the question then is, should you have a public argument with them, or should you follow up with them in person? In a lot of cases, if these are, specific differences of opinion, it's almost best to follow up in person, email them, get in touch with them otherwise. But in some cases, scientists do, go back and push back, especially false facts are being presented. But again, making sure that you're providing the right context and that you're not giving ammunition to someone to then take your words out of context and misappropriate them or misrepresent them. And then the final piece is, there might be occasions, especially if you work in certain fields within environmental health, climate change, scientists get this a lot, that which is, trolling. So they will just get these negative, very, either very negative comments and feedback, or, they would get, people would try to drag them into arguments. And often the response is, if it's not, big enough, then just let it be. You don't have to get into every single argument with people, and especially if you can see that they are not really speaking from a place, in science, if they're just trying to get you to argue with them, it's best to just, move along, ignore that, and that's, in some cases good enough. The other important piece is, how should you write? So all throughout this sort of presentation, I keep coming back to the question, who is your audience? And I think I will ask the same question here again. Who is your audience will determine how you should be writing. So if you are interacting mostly with peers and they understand the jargon from your field, that is all right. But if you're thinking about reaching out to a broader public, or people who are not from your field, they might be scientists but not in your field, then think about the jargon that might be specific to your field, what you think about a certain word versus someone else. On the panel here, I have two examples. One is a small excerpt from an opinion piece I wrote a couple of years ago with a colleague, and I'm not expecting you to read the text, it's far too small, but I ran it through a de-jargonizer. The link to that is on the bottom, scienceandpublic.com, and it essentially picks out the words that are not very common, that are relatively uncommon, people don't use them very much, and highlights them for you. So if you're thinking about communicating with broader audiences, think about using tools like this, at least in the beginning, so you can calibrate yourself in terms of, what's the level that people are comfortable with versus some of the jargon words we use. And then there are words we use a lot of times, especially in research, things like, words like uncertainty or words like bias, which mean very specific things when if you're talking to an epidemiologist and they're talking about bias, they're talking about something specific. But if you just take that word and write something for the common public, their interpretation of the word bias is going to be very, very different. So keep that in mind. Another fun activity, if you are interested and have time, is to try the UpGoer 5 text editor. What this is really is they have a list of 1,000 words that are most commonly used, and you can, they have a text editor, so you can put in your text and start typing, and all of the words that are not in that 1,000-word list are going to be highlighted, and you can just keep going until you actually get it down to those 1,000 words. It's a fun exercise, especially if you're interested in communicating to broader audiences. Besides researchers, I would definitely suggest checking it out. And there is a very cool XKCD comic on this as well. If you are interested, look it up. So if we decide to do all of this, social media activity, how do we keep track of what people are doing? One really good way to do that is through hashtags, which, to think about it, again, think back to a peer-reviewed journal article and the keywords that we pick at the end of the paper. These are the keywords people are going to use to try and find your research article. It's the same principle here. So we have hashtags, which are keywords, and people can then use those keywords or hashtags to try and find what others are posting. I've put up a list of commonly used hashtags here. So, if you have a minute, check them out. They're all very active hashtags that are used by lots and lots of people. If you're interested in science communication, I would highly recommend using the SciComm hashtag on Twitter. You'll find a lot of resources and people to connect with and learn from. So the other place where hashtags are increasingly used is at conferences or workshops or seminars, so that people can post about ongoing talks or discussions that are happening, and it helps others who are not there in real life follow these discussions. I followed several conferences now just with conference hashtags. So if you are interested in a particular conference and you're not attending it, social media can give you an opportunity to get a sneak peek into that world as well. So finally, you've thought about your audience, you've thought about which platform you're going to use. So what should be the content on your social media pages, and how do you plan for it? First of all, think about putting your science in context. A lot of research we do, we are very passionate about it. We really care about what our findings are. But for the larger audiences, what really matters is not so much the methods and the data analysis techniques and whether the p-value was X or Y, but what does it mean for them? Why should they care about this, or what's most relevant information from all of this for them? So think about that aspect of how you contextualize your science or your work within the broader field and interests that people have. Whenever possible, try and use visual elements. So things like photographs, things like infographics and videos and GIFs. There are a variety of online tools. Canva is a really good place to start. It's very easy to use for most of us. You can create a variety of social media sort of content materials. This presentation, by the way, I've used a template from Canva as well. So it's very simple and easy to use. You can use things like Hootsuite and TweetDeck, which essentially allow you to post content ahead of time. So you're not constantly spending time posting content on a daily basis. You can streamline that process. You can also track specific hashtags on Hootsuite as well as TweetDeck, so you know what people are posting and you can keep up with that. And then social media is constantly changing. What the conversations are, what people are saying, what they're most focused on is constantly changing. So it's important to be timely, and it's important to be clear in what you're saying. Again, connect with peers and take time to explore. Think about what you want to say versus the kinds of things that you're mostly interested in getting updates on. I also added a quick slide just for Twitter accounts, mostly because that's where a lot of scientists are, and how can we be effective in 280 characters at a time. So basics, if you have a Twitter account, make sure you have a photo, make sure you have a bio. That just gives you more legitimacy in terms of who you are. Find out who you should be following. Check out some of those hashtags to find the right people in your community, and chances are that a lot of them are already there. So you can start by following them. Twitter also has some very interesting features that can help you stay updated. So one tweet with 280 characters may not be enough, but if you are willing to sort of do a deep dive on a topic, you can do threads that allow you to post a lot of information. You can link to other resources and carry on from that. And then again, as I said earlier, all of these social media platforms are all about engagement and dialogue and communication. So engage with people, ask them questions, highlight your work, but also highlight things that others are doing, which are very interesting and exciting, especially in the field. If others are asking questions, respond to them, share your experiences, tell them about your stories. And in terms of content and how often you should be posting, there are no hard and fast rules. You'll read in some places that you should be posting every day at least 3 or 4 times. It's probably too much for most researchers, but think about at least posting something every once in a while, or engaging with questions or discussions that are ongoing every once in a while. So in summary, we've talked about some of the broad strokes of what social media can be helpful for, what some of the platforms are, some strategies to get you thinking about social media. And the few things that I want you to take away from this discussion today is essentially that you should try to find the right platform that works for you, and that would be based on what your particular goal is and which audience you're trying to interact with and communicate with. There are a number of tools that are out there, so don't get overwhelmed. This is meant to be fun. This is not meant to be another stressful activity added to your sort of daily schedule. So use the tools to stay organized, but also take a break when you need it. Do other things, interact with people in real life for a change. And overall, I think, again, sort of, it is social media, it is public. Whatever you post is going to be out there in the open. So think about what you're writing and think again before you press send. So finally, I may not have hit all the right points for the level of sort of social media use that you do. This might be too basic for some people, but just about right for some others. So please send me any questions, or if you want to talk more about specific platforms, I'll be happy to do that. But one thing I thought that might be fun after the webinar is, if you are active on any of the social media platforms, or primarily Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, do a post. Just do one post on social media. Use the hashtag ISAS webinar, and we can continue the conversation over there. So with that, I would like to thank you all for joining in. And I would also like to thank Nicole and Caitlin and Laura, who made this all happen. And I'm looking forward to some discussion with all of you.
Thanks, Pallavi. Great presentation. So the question box is open. Please type in your questions. We do have an initial question here. So the question is, do you think the general public actually uses QR codes?
That's a good question. And I think what I have seen is, in the US, QR codes are not used very often or very much. So it may not be as relevant for interactions with the broader public here, but in many other countries, especially in Asia, QR codes are used extensively. They're used in advertising, they're used in general sort of communication. So if you are actively engaging with audiences who are based in those regions, then QR code can be very, very efficient. So again, it's sort of a very audience and context dependent use for QR codes, as it is with all of the other platforms in general.
Give people a chance to type in their questions.
So while we're waiting for questions, one other thing that I just wanted to highlight, especially if you are on Twitter and you use it. I know not a lot of people here said they use Twitter, but I will be posting links to a lot of the resources I mentioned during the session. So if you're interested, definitely look it up. It's mostly going to be links to some of the writing from people on their experiences with social media, scientists and their experiences with social media, and some good examples of where to go if you're thinking about science communication using social media as a tool for that.
So I have a question for you, Pallavi.
Mm-hmm.
When you're looking at the bibliometrics on publications, for example, does it help your bibliometric parameters if you actually use social media?
That's a really good question. So one of the things that social media use can do is help get people to see your work in the first place, so more people can actually access it and use it or read about it. And then one of the things that a lot of journals have now started doing is they use the alt metrics. So you know, they actually count things like how many times was this cited in, you know, maybe media articles, or how many times was this downloaded, as well as how many times was this referenced on social media. And there's definitely advantages in some ways, because instead of just reaching that niche audience within a community, using social media can sometimes amplify, you know, who's actually reading it and who's actually able to use it. That was also one of the reasons why Jesse decided to be on social media, to go to audiences that are beyond the niche group or the, you know, sort of the community. So it can definitely help.
Any additional questions from our audience participants? All right, well, I do not see anyone typing, so I would just like to thank Pallavi again for a great seminar. And I would like to let you know that we do have a webinar lined up for March. It is Tuesday, March 24th. The time has not yet been determined, so please watch the ISES website, but Dr. Pat Bricey from the CDC will be speaking. So he has graciously given up his time, so that will be great. Within the next day or so, all the participants who participated today will receive an email from ISES that includes a link for an evaluation. Please take a minute to provide your feedback. The recording for today's webinar, along with the handouts, will also be posted on the ISES members only portion of the website. So that's a reason to join the society if you are not currently a member and you would like to be able to access the webinars. They are behind the member shield. And then also, a last reminder, ISES is accepting abstract submissions for either an oral or poster presentation starting March 2nd for the annual meeting taking place in Oakland in September. And you can find more information about the annual meeting on the ISES website. So thank you very much. Enjoy your day.
Thank you.